for a number of corporations. But what is frightening now is, as you mentioned in your open, how the oligarchy now has moved into and is blatantly controlling the political landscape. And I think what we also now have to then start talking about is the linkage, connecting the dots, if I may plug my show, between the oligarchy, because that's now taking us into fascism. And that is an incredibly frightening reality. When Donald Trump starts talking about using the military to retake the Panama Canal, when Donald Trump starts talking about buying Greenland, making Canada the 51st state, most of that stuff is utter foolishness. We know that. But it's not so much a matter of can he do it or will he do it? It's a matter of what do those expressions convey? So we really have, when you start talking about the oligarchy, when you start talking about Elon Musk and his $270 million that he put into the Trump campaign and the Republican campaign, you need to also to connect the dots between Lewis Powell, the Powell memo, and the Citizens United case. See, folks, this is the way these folks operate is incredibly insidious and strategic, and they take their time to put the things in place, put their ducks in a row, to go back to anyway, to put their ducks in a row so that they can strike and they can move when they need to. So go back again to the Lewis Powell memo, talking about corporations now have to get themselves involved in the political process so that they will be able to retain power. And then you go probably 20 years after the Powell memo, if not a little longer, to the Citizens United case, which allows corporations to invest as much money into political campaigns as they want to. Corporations are now people too.
Dr. Leon, you mentioned that that right behind the oligarchy is the idea of fascism. Connect the dots between historic oligarchies, if you will, and why you think fascism is looming.
Because the elite are now very clearly using their sources and their power to dictate and to dominate the political landscape. Their interests are now the interests that are being served. And the public coffers, in many regards, you talked about these folks becoming trillionaires, they're going to become trillionaires off of their use of the public coffers and off of their use of access that comes from the political circumstance that they have paid for. And they are then going to use the military in order to implement the power that they want to wield. Henry Ford and his attraction to Adolf Hitler. I mean, there's a long history of the oligarchs and their interest, their fascination, their ties to authoritarianism. And
the relationship between these oligarchs is and the government is a long-standing one. I like the idea that you brought forward, the Henry Ford example. Henry Ford had an interest in the government, both federal and state governments, in building roads, building highways. Highways, roads, and streets are a subsidy to the automotive industry. Ford understood that. He had a product that had 4 wheels and a combustion engine. But his product couldn't go anywhere if there were woods and forests and dirt roads. His product couldn't work. So to maneuver the federal government into the idea of building roads and standardizing streets is how oligarchs take advantage of the government to build the infrastructure that they need. You think about the tech infrastructure that is necessary for these tech giants that are around Donald Trump. They need space. They need cabling. They need to traverse the world in order to move their technology. When we come forward, I'm Jesse Jackson Jr. You're listening to the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. This is Jesse Jackson Jr. Welcome back to the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. My guest is Dr. Wilmer Leon. As we come forward, Dr. Leon, talk with us about these executive orders and what they mean for our community as Donald Trump begins to reshape the federal government.
If I can quickly go back to one point from the previous segment, when you were talking about Henry Ford and the expansion of roads and the power he had within the government, look at Los Angeles. Why is the 410 always congested in both? Usually in most cities, there are off times and off peak and on peak times. The 410 is all the 405. I'm sorry, is always on peak. The 10 always on peak. What happened to public transportation in Los Angeles? Because they used to have it. They used to have a trolley system. Goodyear Tire and Rubber wanted, as the interest in the automobile grew in Southern California, Goodyear lobbied the LA city government and the California state government to do away with public transportation so Goodyear could sell more tires. That's just another example of what we were talking about with Henry Ford.
It's a cozy relationship between the government. It's always been there, but now it's brazen. There's a brazenness to what Elon Musk and these guys are trying to do.
And not only is there a brazenness about it, there's also just a blatant disregard for discretion. I remember one of my favorite films is The Godfather. And, the one thing that Don Vito was always concerned about was perception.
Mm-hmm.
And he always wanted to be the guy behind the scenes. He was never one. He would say, who should, when in the opening scene, when all these people are coming to the Don to get him to do them a favor, and when the person would leave, he would turn to he would turn to Tom, and he would say, okay, now who are we gonna give this one to? We're gonna give this one to a councilman in another district, because we don't want our hands on this deal.
And what judges do we know?
There you go. So anyway, so
this
now
particular issue right here, let's let Luca Brasi handle it.
There you go. So now Elon Musk has no qualms about 270 million is what I'm going to spend on Donald Trump and the other Republicans. And then I'm going to be standing right next to him on the stage. Peter Thiel is another one. I'm going to be standing right here next to you on stage with my hand in your pocket. That the lack of discretion is now just beyond the pale. But these executive orders.
Yeah, I'd like to go through a few of them with you.
Please.
President Trump issued an executive order on immigration, curtailing immigration on the southern border. I think it's best if we take these one at a time. He promised mass deportations, but he clearly has not established a policy, and it's certainly not one that has been authorized by Congress. And he's already sending military troops to the southern border. Your thoughts on what that particular order represents and means for urban areas and the rest of our country?
Well, it represents an idiocy there's no logic to this, because first of all, you have to ask yourself, why are these immigrants here? And they're here primarily because of U.S. foreign policy in their countries that have decimated their economies and left these people no choices. Why are Haitians here? Because the United States is trying to reinvade Haiti, because Bill Clinton killed the rice production in Haiti, because the United States went in and killed the black pig in Haiti. Haiti used to export rice. Now they can't grow it. So we have to look at, first of all, why Dole Brands was just convicted in October of funding death squads in Colombia. They were found guilty, and now they've got to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in restitution to the families that the death squads that they paid for murdered. Why are people in Nicaragua trying to come here? Why are people in Guatemala? Because the United States has decimated their economies. That's the first part of the problem that Kamala Harris didn't want to talk about when she went down there. When Joe Biden talked about building the wall, nobody wants to talk about that.
We're listening to Dr. Wilmer Leon, who's one of the foremost authorities on African American history, politics, and culture. He is our guest today on the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. Dr. Leon, birthright citizenship. Donald Trump has taken on the 14th Amendment,
which again is utter just idiocy. Because the 14th Amendment is very clear. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. What part of that don't you get, dude? Now, what I understand they're trying to do is they're trying to contort and twist this to focus on subject to the jurisdiction thereof, as though somehow a child, a woman who migrates to this, is an immigrant in this country and has a child, that now that child is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Well, then how can you arrest them if they're not subject to the jurisdiction? Because being able to, and you graduated from law school. I only went to law school. Being able to take away someone's liberty through your jurisdiction is one of the greatest powers that a government has. Well, if you're not subject to the jurisdiction, how can you be arrested in the first place? The argument is that a sensible question to ask?
I think it's a legitimate question to ask. And I think also the history for our listeners of the 14th Amendment, this is a conversation for African Americans. Any tinkering around the 14th Amendment is a concern for us.
Yes.
Dr. Leon, lay out the case for why African Americans must understand the significance of this debate about immigration as it relates to the Reconstruction Amendment.
Because it was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that abolished slavery, and it was the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that gave those formerly enslaved Africans citizenship. Hence, all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction are citizens. That's what made the formerly enslaved Africans. That's what took us from being formerly enslaved Africans to being African Americans. And that's why whenever I talk about our people in a historic context, if we're talking about a period before the 14th Amendment, I always refer to us as formerly enslaved Africans.
Mm-hmm.
After the 14th Amendment, we are African American. So we have a direct historic vested interest in this conversation.
I have been in some pretty deep and strenuous and difficult debates with people over slavery and over reparations. And I make that same point. If the United States doesn't recognize our citizenship before the 14th Amendment, many Americans don't believe they owe you anything because you weren't a citizen until the 14th Amendment. And everyone who is a beneficiary of the 14th Amendment's clause, the 14th Amendment and its clauses about equality and about citizenship under the law, those citizens aren't due anything, they argue on the other side of this, because they don't want to recognize the America before the 14th Amendment when we argue in 2024 and 2025 about things that we are entitled to, whether it's 40 acres and a mule or anything else on that side of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is at the heart of the reparations conversation, just like it has everything to do with how we're treated by police, where we can live, what schools we can attend, our upward mobility within the society.
It also has to do with the apportionment for representation, because the section 2 deals with apportionment for representation. So if Donald Trump is trying to undermine citizenship, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to figure back in their minds, their evil minds, their next attack would be apportionment of for representation in Congress.
Donald Trump signed an executive order targeting DEI and transgender Americans. Before we get to the transgendered issue, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. He has now frozen all hiring and is preparing to eliminate everyone across the federal government and is encouraging the private sector to follow the government's guidelines on the removal of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Your thoughts and how devastating this is to Brown versus the Board of Education and affirmative action.
It is devastating to all of that, and to be as succinct as I can, what's wrong with diversity? What problem do people have with equity? What's wrong with inclusion? Now, but see, when you start to ask yourself that question, now you get to understand what the slogan "Make America Great Again" really means. Donald Trump is trying to take us back in time. He's not looking forward. He's looking back. Make America great again. When we weren't diverse,
Mm.
when we had no equality, when we were exclusive, not inclusive. This is now that slogan is no longer just a trite slogan. It is the exposition of a mindset and a policy.
Interesting.
That's how he, in his warped mind, makes America great again.
So he sloganeered, "Make America Great Again," but now you're seeing the details of the sloganeering, which is the dismantling, in large part, of Second Reconstruction, Brown versus the Board of Education. That puts on the docket the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which obviously impacts the civil rights not just of African Americans, but of women, of the LGBTQ community, of the disabled, whether they are black, white, striped, or got polka dots. It has the potential to undermine the Voting Rights Act of 1965, your point about reapportionment and representatives in the Congress of the United States and the state legislatures around our country, and the very character of options that we have to vote for as a nation. It undermines public accommodations. So the same Donald Trump who believed in restrictive covenants for living and housing in New York is now suggesting, by definition, that neighborhoods can literally design themselves and set themselves up as private entities that have nothing at all to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, and fair housing laws. I'm Jesse Jackson Jr. You're listening to the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. When we come forward, we will be with the eminent political science, Dr. Wilmer Leon, on the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. I'm Jesse Jackson Jr., and welcome back to the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. My very special guest is Dr. Wilmer Leon. He is an eminent political scientist, one of the nation's leading authority on African American politics, race, culture, and history. Dr. Leon is the author of the books Politics, Another Perspective. Dr. Leon, just before we had to pause, you were making some points about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the relationship to the civil rights movement and that Reconstruction era and that amendment.
Well, and I just wanted to make the point about Trump's attacking and conservatives attacking DEI, and because they say that it's a program of preferential treatment. Well, what is the nomination of Pete Hegseth to head the Pentagon other than preferential treatment?
Wow.
His own mother called him a despicable human being. His ex-sister-in-law just presented us affidavit to Congress saying that his wife at the time had to hide in the closet to save herself from his violent rampages.
Wow.
What is that? And oh, by the by, he's not even qualified to run the agency. So what is he other than a preferential hire? Robert Kennedy Jr. has absolutely no background in public health. But somehow now they want to make him Health and Human Services Secretary.
Preferential treatment.
That I would call as preferential treatment. And the woman who ran the WWF, he wants to make her over the Department of Education, which, by the way, he wants to abolish what is that other than preferential treatment? All I want is consistency. That's and to the point about freezing government hiring, what a lot of people seem to misunderstand, the federal government is in more places than just Washington, D.C.
That's right. That's right.
The government, the United States government is in Iowa. It's in Idaho. It's in Nebraska.
It's in every state in the union with the federal courthouse. It is in the Department of Labor, every state in the union. It is in the Department of Energy, every state in the union.
And North Dakota, South Dakota.
Every state in the union. Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia.
Well, I was going there next. The reason I was highlighting those Midwestern states is because they tend to be red states. And then you go to Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama. I'm going there because a lot of these MAGA folks that live in these states may be employed by the federal government. Donald Trump's coming for your job.
That's interesting because I saw something. There are 2 points that I want to make. The first of which is Washington, D.C. has historically had an African-American mayor. They have petitioned the government a number of times. They have a non-voting representative in the Congress of the United States. They petitioned for statehood, as you know, for many decades. They deserve 2 U.S. senators. They deserve at least 2 members of Congress. And it is majority minority African American. In fact, it used to be called Chocolate City. That's how Marion Barry kept winning. So they've denied us statehood in Washington, D.C. But believe you me when I tell you that the workforce in Washington, D.C. are those African Americans who live in the district. They also live in Maryland and Virginia. And that is some of the wealthiest, most middle class, government supported. BET was started in that area in large measure because of Marion Barry and his relationship with the founder of that organization. So much Black opportunity has come out of District of Columbia. And I think Donald Trump only sees Black folks in DC. So he's going to stop the hiring, slow everything down. No more Black folk in DC should be working in the federal government. But what the point you're making is that the federal government is all over The world. There is no country in the world that does not have a U.S. embassy or a U.S. presence. And the
Other than
ramifications.
Iran.
So on this question of the hiring freeze, its impact on the Black community will be devastating.
Yes, because I can't off the top of my head remember the numbers, but uh, there's a very large percentage of African Americans who work for the federal government. That's one of the I think that's the largest employer. What's the largest employer in the country, and it's the largest employer of African Americans in the country. But people need to understand when he talks about a hiring freeze, that's not just Washington D.C. That's all over the United States. Red states included, MAGA states included. When he talks about cutting the federal government, when he starts talking about doing away with the Department of Education, there are Department of Education offices all over the country. They're in Iowa, they're in Idaho, they're in North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado. We're talking, he's cutting the heads of his own people.
Well, that too, and also African Americans, because I don't know, for example, a historically Black college and university in this country whose research dollars don't come from the federal government.
Mhm.
I don't know an HBCU whose infrastructure money to expand their colleges, universities, including dormitories and new teacher assisted facilities, classrooms on college campuses, doesn't come from the federal government. But I also saw an interesting news program, I think it was on CNN, just the other day, where they went to a poor white county, a coal mining county, where
Mhm.
this particular public elementary school has predominantly white kids in it. The principal said she was a Donald Trump supporter.
Mhm.
She was caught up in the MAGA movement. But the idea of closing the Department of Education and them no longer receiving funding because they provide meals for their students at that school. She said, I can say with a near absolute certainty that students that will leave our school on Friday
Will go
will
home.
not eat until we see them again on Monday morning. The food programs are in the Department of Education.
Mhm.
This is a very, very difficult period. I know we're going to be coming forward in about another minute, but Dr. Leon, let me give you that 1 minute before we come forward.
Well, just to that point, my dear friend and mentor Tom Porter says a lot of them would rather eat their racism than sit down and have a fine meal. And that's what this teacher in this Appalachian school district full of children of coal miners is telling you. And that's one of the things I could never understand. For example, about Mitch McConnell, I couldn't understand why then President Obama didn't go hold a press conference in Mitch McConnell's driveway and say, look, you all in Kentucky, I know you don't like me. That's fine, but I am your president. And the things I'm offering for you, dental care for all you toothless Appalachian coal miners, what is Mitch McConnell doing for you? He's
Mm.
telling you about Obamacare. I'm trying to put you all in the hospital.
I'm Jesse Jackson Jr. You're listening to Dr. Wilmer Leon on the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. When we come forward, we'll be back with Dr. Leon. I'm Jesse Jackson Jr. Our very special guest is Dr. Wilmer Leon. Dr. Leon is one of the nation's foremost authority on politics, political scientist, Howard University PhD. Dr. Leon, before our break, we were talking about what this Trump administration means for African Americans, what it means for progressives, and just how expansive these executive orders are that seek to reform, reshape the federal government and what it means against the backdrop of the history of African Americans, whose very liberation, I might add, was when Abraham Lincoln organized federal troops, allowed African American colored troops to fight for the Union, come down south and stop these states' riders from seizing the federal government. In a real sense, Dr. Leon, it feels like Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, in the long game of the Civil War, have won.
Wow, that's a very interesting point. And that would be a very hard point for me to argue. And Steve Bannon, who was Donald Trump's key advisor in the 2016 campaign, told us very early on that their main objective was the deconstruction of the administrative state. And I think that has really went past a whole lot of people. What you see Donald Trump trying to do now is deconstruct the administrative state. And he now has the oligarchs as the wind in his sails. And that is the mission that they're on. Elon Musk has replaced Steve Bannon, but and I don't think that Elon Musk could even spell administrative state in terms of understanding what that really means. But the mouthpieces have changed, but I think the focus remains the same.
Dr. Leon, I have not heard anyone articulate better, stronger, and more clearer analysis of the missed opportunity of Joe Biden to reshape the political landscape with the pardon power. Share with our listeners your thoughts.
Well, I got a lot of this from you, and understanding your mission and your efforts to get those 77 million nonviolent felons pardoned. And when you look back at what Abraham Lincoln was able to do with the Emancipation Proclamation, and how post-Lincoln blacks were Republicans. My grandfather was a Republican, and asked him why. That was the party of Lincoln. That is the party that, as the adage goes, freed the slaves. Now, we could talk about the validity of that whole thing, but that's the sentiment that resonated within the African American community. That was practical politics, practical operational politics, freed the slaves. Now we fast forward to Joe Biden, and with the stroke of a pen, he could have pardoned, returned full citizenship to 77 million people of all stripes, all colors, all economic backgrounds. They missed a tremendous opportunity, because those people would have looked at Joe Biden returning full citizenship to them as a dramatic impact on their everyday lives. That's real politics. That's operational politics. That's practical politics. Those folks would have gone to the Christmas party, to the cookout with that pardon letter in their hand, and said, Joe Biden restored my citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
A lot. When you ask a lot of folks who don't vote, why don't you vote? The answer is because that's not going to have any impact on my life. No matter who I vote for, my circumstance is not going to improve. That is the mindset of a lot of non-voters in the United States. If their uncle, if their mother, if their sister, if their brother were able to walk through their front door with this letter in their hand and a big smile on their face and said, my citizenship has just been restored because Joe Biden granted me a pardon. Not only is that person with their letter in their hand gonna now become a Democrat, but the folks that are tangentially related to them will give a whole nother amount of consideration of voting, and if they vote, who they'll vote for, because now there's been a practical improvement in their circumstance. And Joe Biden and the Democrats fumbled that ball.
Not only did they fumble it, I mean, they fumbled it and the team is picking it up and running in the other direction. I do not agree with pardoning people who have not paid their debt to society.
Mhm.
Those rioters, those 1,500 pardons, it is his right to do it. That right does exist in the Constitution. But if Donald Trump ever figures out that in our barber shops across this country are men who learned to cut hair in the joint,
Mm-hmm.
that in beauty parlors around this country are women who learned to cut hair and shape hair and curl hair in the joint. When Donald Trump and conservatives realize that there are men and women who didn't just go through the process and get pardoned, there are men and women who paid their debt to society and still cannot fulfill their basic life needs and circumstances. And if he, in fact, pulls the trigger for them, I'm really, really concerned about the future of the Democratic Party, because I know in African American households, including my own, there's a picture of Bobby Kennedy, there's a picture of Abraham Lincoln, there's a picture of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And my hope was that Joe Biden would have a letter in most of our homes that say, I'm restoring your citizenship right. If Donald Trump puts that letter in these people's homes, you won't be able to tell them nothing about the person who gave them a new chance in this system. And that is the danger of playing with forgiveness. And I look at it from a historical perspective. I'm sorry I get animated about it because I've been in this for a minute. When you think about what the Catholic Church was doing with indulgences that led to Martin Luther tacking his 95 Theses on the church at Wittenberg, and the fact that it began a reformation of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation, over how to handle forgiveness and making forgiveness available for all. Forgiveness itself is the power of Jesus of Nazareth and the power of his ministry. I am concerned, I fear and shudder for the Democratic Party. If Donald Trump wields his pen for the debt-paid felon the same way he wielded his pen for these Capitol rioters, people will forget about that number because it's too small and it pales by comparison. Dr. Leon, we have about another minute and a half, and I'd love for you to take this opportunity to say what you'd like to say.
Well, to that point, African Americans became Republican because the practical politics of Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. In the 40s, we started shifting to the Democratic Party because of FDR and the Great Society program and the
New Deal.
New Deal. Thank you. And we, again, practical politics. And then our allegiance to the Democratic Party was solidified in the 60s with the civil rights movement, the Kennedy administration. What did Daddy King say? I got thousands of votes in my pocket for John Kennedy, right?
He called my son when he was in prison.
And the Great Society program of Lyndon Johnson. Practical politics. And that, we aren't wedded to these parties because we're stupid. We're not wedded to these parties because we're ignorant. We understand the practical impact that these parties have had on our lives over time. And this is a missed opportunity by Joe Biden. I don't think that Donald Trump is going to be that smart, but there is an opportunity for them to make a move.
My very special guest has been Dr. Wilmer Leon. He is one of the eminent political scientists in our nation. His podcast, his show, tell us a little bit about that as we wrap up.
Well, the podcast is called Connecting the Dots. It now airs live every day, Monday through Friday, from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. And I'm on Sirius XM radio Saturdays from 11 to 2. The program is Inside the Issues. I'd have wonderful people like Jesse Jackson Jr. on the show because we talk about practical politics. We call it I call them as I see them because I see them as they are.
This is the Jesse Jackson Jr. Show. Thank you for being our guest today.
My pleasure.